I'm Tyler, and today we're wrapping up game equations. So, you know the drill. Do your YouTube chores down below, and I'll hit the intro because we're going down the warp pipe. Alright, so I'm excited to wrap this up, but this one I'm going to try to make short and sweet if I can. We're talking about genres. Let's jump right into this because we have a whole bunch to get through. So, first up, we're going to talk about the action genre. These are the games that you're, generally playing for the action. Stuff like first person shooters would definitely fall into this category. Stuff like third person action games would definitely fall into this category as well. But the next one up is going to be adventure. These games by themselves tend to be more like the Telltale games or the LucasArts games of old, where you're experiencing a story, maybe solving some puzzles, having conversations with characters. But then if you decide to wiggle some action in there, you actually end up getting games that are action adventure games, like a lot of big budget games now. So stuff like Zelda would definitely be an action adventure game. Something like Ghost of Tsushima single player, an action adventure game. We're going to get into one of my favorite genres, which is racing games. So, racing games, it's obviously pretty straightforward to understand. You're driving usually a vehicle. There are some exceptions like Sonic R, where the character's running, but 9 times out of 10, it's a vehicle. Whether it's a car or like F-Zero, a spaceship, or like Wipeout, I don't even know what you'd call that, like a hover vehicle or something. It's usually a vehicle, and you're trying to get to the end. One of my favorite things in racing games is actually the point A to point B race, where it's not a loop and a track around the course, but rather you're getting from point A, like I said, to point B. I found those a lot of fun. Mario Kart has a few of them, like the Wario Woods, I think. It's the snow one, basically. Whenever I see it, I always pick that, but that's one of my favorites. Anyways, moving on from there, we're going to get into the shooter genre. Now, I mentioned that the action games, first person shooters and stuff, can fall into that category. Um, Shooters are definitely their own subcategory that are worth mentioning of an action game. Action games usually involve more hand to hand combat, but shooters obviously are shooting. You're firing a gun. It can be first or third person, something like Doom, Halo, or um, Wolfenstein would be first person. But you get into third person, you have stuff like Last of Us, you have stuff like Uncharted, you have one of my favorites, Vanquish, which I think is horribly underrated. Definitely check that out if you get a chance. They've ported it to PS4. I believe Xbox One as well, but definitely PS4. Going from shooters, we get into fighting games. These are generally one on one, but you can also get things like Smash Brothers that can go up to 8 people. But the core of this is usually one on one Street Fighter, obviously, an easy to think of example. Fighters in the name. But you have stuff like Mortal Kombat as well, and even some more obscure games like Skullgirls that are in there. Personally, one of my favorites is definitely Killer Instinct, actually on the Xbox One. I really hope they bring that back for some new content, but that had a really, really good balance. I still love the Super Nintendo and N64 versions, obviously the arcades. I grew up there. But the Xbox One version, I think, is a really great example of a balanced fighting game. But moving on, we have puzzle games. These games are easily the most popular type of game known to man. So you have stuff like Tetris, you have stuff like Candy Crush. These are all kind of puzzle games, maybe not in the most traditional sense, but for me, my favorite puzzle game is easily Portal and Portal 2. It's a different take on puzzles and allows you to use some of the fun features of physics in those puzzles. Definitely Breath of the Wild did a very similar job to this. So I actually really love the shrines. If I could hop between the different shrines, that would have me jumping into Breath of the Wild just to play the shrines. Um, but obviously the fun of it is experiencing the new shrines, and you have to eventually get to that to find them. Moving on, we have one of my favorite genres to spend time with when I have a good chunk of time, and that's the simulation game. These are going to be stuff like Microsoft Flight Simulator or SimCity. Those are the two that really stand out to me, and City Skylines, um, Planet Coaster, Roller Coaster Tycoon. A lot of these kind of sim management games, they're a lot of fun if you have a good amount of time to sit down, relax, maybe have a snack, pull a drink, you're set. Or if it's winter and you're cold, you have a hot drink, like a hot chocolate, like I'm gonna have after this. But simulation games are a phenomenal option if you maybe have never dipped your toe into other games. The Sims, obviously. If you haven't tried anything else and you've only maybe played puzzle games on your smartphone, this is a great type of game to jump into that can be a little daunting at the beginning, but if you pick the right game, my personal recommendation, Planet Coaster or Two Point Hospital. Um, Two Point Hospital is a fantastic jumping in point for simulation games. But that's another video, the Where to Start series I'll get to at some point, but just a little heads up. The next category, a lot of times these two games have very similar mechanics, but strategy games, specifically real-time strategy games and turn-based strategy games are very different flavors. For me, I'm much more a fan of real-time strategy games, although I don't really have the time to play them as much as I would like anymore. They tend to require too much time out of you for one play session. I tried to play StarCraft Remastered when it came out, and I started to get into it through the single player, and I just couldn't do it anymore. It takes too long to get through everything. It wasn't frantic enough. There wasn't that constant dopamine hit of one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. But fantastic games if you have some time set aside for them. Turn-based strategy games, on the other hand, can sometimes be a lot quicker to get through, but really don't do a whole lot for me. They're more like playing a game of chess, which at that point I would probably just go play chess personally, but I'm playing a video game for a specific reason. That being said, turn-based strategy games like Final Fantasy Tactics, Fire Emblem, or even the XCOM series are great games, and if you're into that stuff, they're a great jumping in point. Moving on, we get into it with RPGs. Now, there's really a lot to get into here, so I'm going to not waste too much time with it. But you really have two different schools of thoughts for RPGs. When Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars came out for Super Nintendo, yeah, I thought it stood for real people graphics, but it stands for role playing game. And I'd actually played Final Fantasy games before then, so I was not unknowing of what was happening or what the games were about. I just didn't understand what RPG stood for, other than rocket propelled grenade. Um, but that's from shooters. So, getting into RPGs, you really have two separate schools of thought, like I mentioned. You have the Western RPG and the what I like to call Eastern, or more commonly known as Japanese RPG. So with the Western stuff, that's usually more computer RPGs, stuff like Skyrim. Um, that's the biggest one sort of out there. But you get into Dragon Age and Mass Effect, even, I would argue, are slotted securely in that sort of Western or computer based RPG because they have their foundations really from the old days of Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and sort of Dungeons and Dragons. But when you jump into the Japanese RPGs, those are really firmly rooted in Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy as kind of their foundations. That's where a lot of those came from, at least as far as I'm aware. There's probably something I'm missing, and if you know, definitely drop it in the comments down below. But those games have, I would almost say, a very different feel to them. Where the computer RPGs are usually more about your self expression, the Japanese RPGs tend to be more about telling a specific story. Definitely two genres or one genre with two different flavors that I love. And I like them for both very different reasons. But Japanese RPGs nowadays tend to fall more into the category of needing to dump 100 hours into them versus something like computer RPG where you can dump in maybe 30 or 40 hours and still get a really good experience out of them. One of the most near and dear genres to my heart, which is the platformer, both 2D and 3D. But a platformer really is a game where the primary objective is jumping around. So you have stuff even like Uncharted that has platforming sections in it. But really, when we're talking platformer, we're talking Mario, we're talking Sonic to a lesser degree, I would argue. More of an action game, but action platformer. Stuff like Rocket Knight Adventures and the near and dear to my heart Donkey Kong Country series. So they're some of the easiest to understand if you have someone who's never played a game before. Throw them a controller, hop in a 2D platformer, and have them go to town. They'll definitely learn a bit. It's where I started and where I think everyone should start in terms of traditional games, at least. We're getting to the flight games. So I mentioned Flight Simulator under the simulation category, but flight games are definitely their own sort of genre. You have stuff like Panzer Dragoon, Crimson Skies is a great game from the original Xbox that I wish they would bring back, and Star Fox, which are awesome flying games. You're flying around. Halo has a part of that in it. You can get into the Banshees and fly around and do a whole bunch of stuff, but really flying games are their own thing. You're almost always in a vehicle, although not necessarily. Stuff like Nights into Dreams, you're flying as a character. But for the most part, like racing games, you're in a vehicle. I actually kind of like the idea of flying and racing combining, like they did in the Sonic All Stars Transformed, I believe it was. I definitely know Transformed was in there. I would have mentioned it by itself, saying specifically it's survival horror, but survival, I think, nowadays needs to be broken into its own primary header, and then survival horror is well within that. So, survival games generally tend to be about you versus the elements, or, you versus the element of horror in something like a survival horror game. But really, it's where you're trying to get through, and there's a lot of suspense and a lot of tension, I would say. I define them by tension. Breath of the Wild actually has a lot of survival mechanics in it. So when you're dealing with the cold, or you're dealing with having to change outfits for the heat, or having to change, drink potions and things like that for swimming, there's a lot of sort of survival elements thrown in it. A more pure example of that would be something like Don't Starve, where you're trying to collect resources and stay alive throughout the nights. Um, they're not necessarily my cup of tea, but I like them when they're sprinkled in. So something like Last of Us, I super loved because it had survival elements to it. It had that tension that you get from survival, without necessarily being purely survival. Just the last two categories that I wanted to mention, and they're nice and easy to rattle off. So you have the sports games. These are generally where you're playing something that is traditionally a sport: basketball, hockey, soccer, you know, football, the most popular sport. Not talking about you, Madden, but that is definitely the most popular in terms of America, which is down south. However, sports games don't tend to be my cup of tea unless you're talking about stuff from the earlier areas, stuff like NBA Jam or NFL Blitz. Those are awesome, and I had a lot of fun playing them. Not that I don't like the sports games, they tend to just be too bland for what I want out of a video game. I'm playing a game to play something that I can't play in real life. So for me, if I want to play hockey or something like that, I'll go play hockey. Although that's not bound to happen. I'm not the best skater, and I'm also not that really into sports. But if I do want to play them, I'll probably try and play them in person rather than in a video game, just because there's so many other things I could be doing. I could be a cowboy in Red Dead, or I could be a ninja in Ghost of Tsushima. Just a lot more appealing to me personally. But definitely huge, definitely big, and definitely not going anywhere. However, the last category kind of has made a little resurgence, and that is the music game. I specifically say music as opposed to rhythm because music games are kind of near and dear to my heart, but also I think they're really specifically their own thing. So you have rhythm games, which it's a mechanic that fits into a game like a music game. However, sometimes you have stuff like User where it's not really about the rhythm, it's about you mixing the songs together. The easiest examples that everyone should really know here is obviously Guitar Hero and Rock Band. Those are the two that I still could easily pick up and play today. I know they aren't popular anymore, but for me, they fit a really specific point in my life, and there's a bit of nostalgia fitting there, for sure. So that sort of rounds up all the genres here. I know there's definitely some I missed. Mention them down below, and you know, maybe I'll have to pick apart some of these to get a little bit deeper because there's a lot of stuff that I missed out on. Like RPGs, you tend to level up and you earn levels rather than progressing through levels, so you get more powerful as you play them. And like I said, I didn't want to take up too much time. I want to wrap this up nice and neat. So we're going to get to those examples. That's going to wrap it up for the game equations. I definitely would have loved to dive deeper into a lot of these topics, and will at some point with the game language series. But for now, we're going to wrap it up here, put a bow on it, and I'll see you on Thursday